The early 17th century begins when Elizabeth I dies and James I takes over in 1603, and it'll end about in 1660. And while the 57 years may seem like a strange time to pull out on their own, there's a lot of political and cultural ideas happening at this time and huge changes for England that make it a period that we need to study and really focus in on, because if the changes that happened during this period didn't happen, then England wouldn't really be the England it is today. So, as I mentioned, Elizabeth I dies, and she never married. She never has any children. So James I takes over and becomes the King of England. He is from Scotland, so people were not thrilled with that. Um, but this is a non-violent start to his career. So at a time where it could have been very violent, very chaotic, thankfully James I takes over in a way that is relatively peaceful. People are pretty hopeful about James I being king, because he is a man who seems to be in his prime of his age. He's already married with heirs, so there shouldn't be any concerns about who's going to take the throne after him. And they think that he's going to be very decisive and stable. And he also really loves literature. So for writers, that's a huge plus. However, like I mentioned, they didn't love that he was raised in Scotland, and he is very authoritarian, and he wants to be respected and feared as an absolute power from God. And that sent up some, concerns, but people were like, well, it might work. However, it didn't quite work. James I, in general, is kind of a horrible ruler, and that sounds extreme, but there's a lot of things he does that doesn't go over well. He's not very personable. He's not very kind. He is a dictator, and he has absolute power, and what he wants is what he wants. And he believes that any of his desires are a divine mandate, and they are to happen how he wants them to happen. He's also really bad at financials. Um, while Elizabeth I worked really hard to help fix some of the finances in England in terms of the crown, especially from like her father, James I just doesn't care. He spends money willy nilly. He just knights or ennobles different courtiers. Um, Left and right. He was notorious for financial headlessness and inability to restrain himself, as the editors say of your textbook. He also showed favoritism at the court, and so did Queen Elizabeth. But Elizabeth's favoritism was based off your abilities and what you could do to further the court and the country. James I is solely concerned, it seems, with the looks of his male courtiers. He also has two very open affairs, and there's a lot of concerns that the court is just being run uh, over by homosexuality. And in 2023, that might be a different discussion, but in the 1600s, this was a huge issue. Technically, homosexuality was a crime. You could be killed for it. Anything against the church is a crime. So, for someone who's supposed to be a religious leader and a leader of the country, to be flouting those laws so blatantly and it, without concern, it did cause some issues for people. However, this is also a time when close male friendships become very important and are really developed, and we'll see that in some literature where, and that happens, and you can see that some throughout. So, on one hand, his favoritism isn't always logical, but the other hand, it did allow for like close friendships to be formed in a way that they hadn't yet. Even though James I had a lot of issues, he was still very politically sound in some ways. He'd make some great decisions for the country. So he keeps them out of wars, the religious wars happening on the continent. He establishes peace with Spain in 1604, which is the first time in a very long time that they have peace. And which allows for safe passages for ships, which helps them with their import exports and also helps with colonialism. He also makes the first permanent settlers in North America. So instead of just expeditions and come back, he helps make settlements. And while we know the history of American colonies, like this, these politically, these were some sound decisions that helped his country. He also stays out of economics, which allows it to flourish, and some future beliefs and ideas are started in this time. So some of the things we see in economics today and some basic economic theories start really picking up here because James I just doesn't care about finances. And so they're allowed to do what they do best. Now, in context as well, just like economics, when James I does not get overly involved in religion, things are doing great. They're relatively calm and things do fine, and it can flourish. However, because religion is just such a tense idea in England still, um, and the religious orders kind of wanted to use religion to reinforce the socio-political order. There are some pushes for James I to have to step in, and then when he refuses and tries to stay neutral, people make their own decisions and it spirals out of control. So James I does have a conference when he comes into his kingship. He allows leaders from all sorts of denominations to come in and talk to him and speak, their mind and advocate for themselves. And he listens, and it seems promising. However, he doesn't really take action. Neither side feels like they've won anything out of it. And unfortunately, it just doesn't go well. The Puritans are like, fine, we're just going to make our own religious leaders and start trying to strip you of power where we can. Catholicism, doesn't get any boost, which they thought they would when James I came into leadership. So Catholics are kind of upset. And then you have the gunpowder plot that happens in 1605. Remember the 5th of November. And that just cements that Catholics are to be kind of squashed at this point. James I can't do anything to help them. So while religion had a moment of kind of like sanity and we're calm, it quickly spirals out of control. And it's one of the things that's going to help lead into the civil war that is coming. But one neat thing that King James does do in 1611, he publishes the King James Version of the Bible, which is still a very popular version of the Bible used today. So he does, just like his reign, he did some things that weren't great, but then he also has these moments of like sparks of greatness. So we are now quickly approaching the English Civil War. James I dies, his son Charles I becomes king. He doesn't exactly believe in absolute power in that he has a divine mandate like his father James believed, but he still rules that way and he has extreme inflexibility. He disbands parliament 3 times and at one point rules for a decade without allowing them to meet or have any say. And he is working really hard at government. So he pays off debts. He controls financial issues that the court has. He's making good decisions like building up the Navy. However, he alienates his population from his absolute power and just dismissing the court whenever he doesn't work with them. So he doesn't know how the public is feeling about him. And then the court also doesn't support him when he needs it. The religious divide is going to worsen under Charles I because his wife is Catholic and she is actively pushing for Catholicism at court, which she also helps introduce to Charles I to a more ornate style of a religious setting, which he loves. And then he starts pushing for that. So now the Puritans are alienated because they want simple, not ornate. And he's like, nope, this is what I want. He's allowing for the Catholicism to grow. And then he appoints William Laud as an archbishop who believes grace is for everybody, not just the predestined. So again, the Puritans get further pushed away and alienated, which they are a large part of the population at this point. So you don't want to alienate a large portion of your population. Laud is a very strict ruler. He aligns the church back a little bit with the Roman Catholic doctrine. So, works are just as important, not just grace. And unfortunately, Charles I tries to make Scotland conform to the English habits and styles of religion. So then now Scotland is kind of like upset with Charles and what he's doing. So all of these come to a head. And this is a time of turmoil for both James I and Charles I, and then eventually Charles II. And so Charles says, help, I need help. And he calls Parliament back after he had disbanded them because a revolution is coming quickly on all ends: finances, politics, because of absolute power, religion. things are just not looking great. So the Civil War is coming. So in 1640, Charles I requests Parliament to reconvene. Um, they come back. He wants just quick help, but they refuse to disband. This becomes the Long Parliament, and their goal was to secure rights and access to the government, not overthrow the king necessarily. However, during this time, they let the press censorship die, which means political discussions can be written about, can be published with no threats. So ideas are going to go and go and go. In 1641, Charles tries to arrest some of the parliament for treason, but he ends up having to flee himself, which leads to the First Civil War. It runs from 1642 to 1646. The parliament and Presbyterian clergy have limited money, so they don't have enough to really make this work long term, but their goal is to secure power away from the king, not just kill him, just pull away some of that absolute power. However, because the religious groups cannot work together through this, it kind of flounders to an end, but it does reinforce the idea that different faiths cannot coexist, which is going to light things on fire again. So there is an attempt at negotiation. However, there's a second civil war that kicks up very briefly, and Charles I is defeated in 1648. This becomes a huge moment in history. He is defeated. He is no longer a king. He's just Charles Stuart, and they're going to execute him. They have executed the King of England, and because they were worried he could pull people to him with his strong personality. So they start to form a republic as the best they can. They write the first constitution. However, it's very rocky and not strong. So they name Oliver Cromwell as the Lord Protector in 1653. And while he does some great things in terms of abroad that helps the country, and he raises their prestige in Europe, he is a dictator with absolute power, and he is very harsh, and he cracks down on everything. So people don't like him. They're protesting. And so even though Cromwell's son takes over for a couple of years, by 1660, Charles II is brought home, and they restore him to the throne. So it's the restoration period. But now it's a constitutional monarchy. All the power doesn't doesn't live with the monarchs. You have some power, the legislative power in Parliament. We still have some new political parties that develop and causes some more, layers to politics. Freedom of press is going to continue. And now the merchant class has power which is pretty new at this time. So they have a say and they have a voice in this period. So in a very short time period, we have a lot of religious issues, political transformations, economics are developing, church and state, freedom of press. Things are happening very rapidly, and they come to this head where we have a tense period where we have civil war, execution, but then we bring our monarch back to the throne, and we're going to have a little bit of a sigh of relief when that moment hits.